Hi there, and welcome to Hearthside. My name is Michelle. I am the author on this blog. This is part of a 4-part series on the Northern European forest commons, and this particular part is part 2, which has to do with the history of the forest commons. If you're coming in now, you might want to go back and watch my first video or read my first entry on my blog, whichever format is the best for you. But if you specifically just want to know about the history of the Northern European forest commons, you could just stick around as well. That's up to you. And it will be just the history for the whole post. So yay to that, I guess. A brief overview before we get into that, just of what we're covering in this particular part. The original forest commons. And then the changing definitions of king and what that meant for the commons. The expansion of kingdoms and the creation of crown land. And then how the Enclosure movement created landless people and led to industrialization. And then a little bit where we're talking about inequity and clashes between Sami reindeer herders and farmers. A section on the influence of the church on all of this. And then we talk about what happened in the 1800s that was the changing and restructuring of the Enclosure movement. Finally, we start talking about the modern return of forest commons and what that means today. Historically, the forest commons resembled more closely the hamlet commons of modern Norway. So the hamlet commons meant that each person sort of had their own piece of land, and then outside of it, they had land where they could graze their animals that was shared land. And this was called the field to meadow system. Field areas were cultivated, and then common outland areas were used for hunting, tar and iron production, and for livestock herding. This was the way that the commons were run in medieval times, and likely before. We don't know for sure because it was only at the beginning of the medieval period that they started to record things. So the commons and the king is something that we need to understand, because this is how the Enclosure movement started. Initially, we could see that the first medieval laws for the commons were regulated by a ruler of sorts. In Norway, the king had the right to allocate lands to settlers. And it was important to understand that at this time, the king, in this context, meant a ruler of often a single settlement, so more the way that we would view a chieftain. The settlements were well spaced at this time, with very little need for rivalry, and any disagreements about resources were resolved at the thing. Now, as the settlements grew, then this began to change. As communities grew, it became more difficult for them to be defensible, and that means that the commoners signed over more of their rights to rulers in exchange for promised safety. This eventually led to the Enclosure movement as the kings gained more and more power. So the communities grow. As a result, there's more land within them, and the king is slowly getting more and more power, whereas before he was a chieftain of a small area, and if it didn't work out, maybe you would kick out the chieftain and put in a new one. But as things expanded, the king gained more and more power, had more and more soldiers at his disposal to help protect this larger land that needed to be defensible, but that also meant that the commoners had less and less power. And the kings became greedy and began to take advantage of the situation, and the result was crown land. Medieval lords took large tracts of land for their own sport, depriving the commoners of the land that they depended on for subsistence. And it's really important that we remember this idea of crown land, because this is going to factor in when we start looking at how this relates to modern heathenry within Canada and to what happens more generally to the land in Canada and probably other colonized places as well. So the creation of the concept of crown land occurred as the result of medieval lords taking land for their own and creating the enclosure movement instead of the commons that previously existed. Crown land was the first privatization of land previously held as commons, and it contributed to the commoners being deprived of their livelihood. This occurred in a number of different ways. And during this same period, the ruling class sought more power, and they went about creating laws that would cause commoners from other regions to migrate into the area to farm with special benefits. Now, why would they do that? Why would you want people to migrate in and start farming? I'm going to take the example of the Forest Finns, which happened in Sweden, or what existed pre-Sweden. And who are the Forest Finns? The Forest Finns were a group of Finnish people who were given tracts of land between the forest and the pasture land in Sweden. So previously the pasture land was what was farmable by the Swedish farmers, whereas the forest they might go hunting and gathering berries and whatever other things. But this was not land that the Swedish farmers found farmable. However, the Forest Finns used a different method of farming called slash and burn. And this meant that they would cut down pretty much all the timber on that land, and it would help to fertilize the soil in part and allow them to farm that land. These methods, however, they were very high yield, but after 2 generations, the land would be left fallow for another 20 years before it could be used again, because it basically devastated that area. So what was the problem with this other than the obvious ecological issues with using this method? The problem was that the Swedish farmers could not compete with the high yield of this method, and as a result, the Forest Finns were making more money on their farming and putting the Swedish farmers out of business. The Forest Finns came in, caused clashes between Swedish farmers and also with the Sami people who used the forest commons for reindeer husbandry. As a result of Swedish farmers being unable to continue farming with the competition that had moved in, they would often have to desert their farms, and it created a new class of landless people. Now, these people had no land, and they needed a new method of livelihood. It forced them to move into the cities and be the new workforce of these industrialized areas. Here's where the forest industry or the timber industry comes into play. The settlement sizes were increasing as people flocked to the cities, and as the population just grew because they were getting better agriculture and they were able to support more people. The settlement sizes were increasing, and the result was the need for more timber for building and for more firewood to heat all of these new buildings. And this led to the timber industry and the move towards privatization of land that allowed the timber industry to thrive and to sell to foreign markets as well as locally. The landless people now became the workers of this unforgiving industry, and it was very dangerous working in the timber industry back then. And they also became workers in all the other different industries within the cities, all the factories, everything that formed as a result of a larger community. But in particular, it is important to note that this landless population was forced into this dangerous line of work within the timber industry. Now, we're just going to, put that on side burner for a minute. We'll need to think about the timber industry again very shortly. But I want to talk briefly about the influence of the church, because there were some interesting things going on here. They were definitely a third party to the creation of the Enclosure movement, and although the church sought to convert people among the commoners of these regions, they often sided with the forest commons and sustainable practices in forestry as well as hunting, probably to get on the good side of the common people because they wanted to convert them. But it's just interesting that that's usually how they sided. That isn't to say, though, that the church did not play a hand in what was going on, because as people were displaced from the commons, they flocked into the newly formed cities in search of livelihood. And who was there to welcome them but the church, offering them warm meals, a sympathetic shoulder, and of course, the Word of God. So, while the church did not really directly have a hand in the Enclosure movement, it benefited from it. And as the commoners became severed from the land as a result of their displacement, the church further alienated them from the local spirits of place by demonizing those spirits. The churches were often built over the pagan sacred sites, and ancestor veneration was discouraged. And the stories of the gods in Landvetir were respun to favor Christianity and within the Christian narrative. Moving back to talking about what else was occurring during this time, we come upon the Enclosure movement changes of the 1800s. So there was some changes that occurred during this time, and these were largely due to the adoption of Cartesian mindset. So René Descartes, he wrote his work, Meditations, in the 1600s, and it was gaining traction within European cities and among European scholars. The premise is that non-humans are dead or soulless, which justifies the commodification of the natural world as resources to be exploited. This new ideology meant that the Enclosure movement that had up till this point been slowly eating away at Northern European connection to land for centuries, now had a way to move towards industrialization and commodification of resources at a much faster rate. Scientists and industrialists welcomed the Cartesian mindset, and it allowed them to extract violence against the non-human populations, and by extension also against populations of other humans as well. So how did this occur that you're able to use it against other humans? Because it still says that humans within the Cartesian mindset are not dead or soulless, but they created this narrative of some humans being worth less. And this is exactly the creation of the concept of racism that occurred in Northern Europe. I'll get into that more in the next section primarily, as right now I want to focus on the land and our alienation from that. But the two are very much correlated. So trauma from being severed from the land in Northern Europe directly led to colonization of other parts of the world. It was intergenerational trauma within Northern Europe at its loss of connection with the landscape that started around the 1200s, and it allowed the breaking down of communities in the traditional sense in these regions. It led to the new concepts of industrialization, commodification, eventually colonization, and even capitalism. But before the Northern Europeans colonized other people, they colonized themselves. And this is what I mean about us needing to decolonize our mindset, because our colonized mindset is that the other than human natural world is less than us, and as a result that we can commodify it and exploit the resources. So this is not in any way an attempt to accuse or to excuse the destruction of land or of cultures that was inflicted by Northern Europeans on other people around the world. Rather, it's an attempt to determine what created such violence against humans and other than human populations by the people of the North. And by understanding this piece of history, perhaps it will give us clues as to what we need to do to heal this rupture going forward. For the sake of the narrative, before we get into that in our later sections, it's important that we know what happened next. So what happened in the 1800s in the Enclosure movement was the redistribution of privately owned lands away from the nobility and towards holdings that were owned either by wealthy individuals or companies. This allowed for much larger scale devastation and exploitation of the landscape than ever before when it was paired with the Cartesian mindset. Let's move back to the timber industry. So we know that the settlement sizes increased gradually between 1274 and 1687, and that there was more need for the timber and firewood. We also know that the Cartesian mindset was what led to these rapid industrializations using new technologies that were just coming into play. So, for example, steam power was, to the 1800s, what internet is to our modern times. The rapid changes and expansions of the 1800s were fueled by the timber industry because timber was needed to build the railways and the ships. Up until the industrial age, there were still people living outside the cities who were largely unaffected by the influences of the crown, the church, within their daily lives. These heath dwellers, or heathens, were able to keep alive some of the old traditions in the forms of folk tales or folk traditions, which is not to say that these were traditions that remained intact within family lineages, as you might hear some people claim today. Instead, the change was much more gradual, took longer to take root in the rural areas due to the isolation and largely being out of sight and out of mind of the church and the state. As we move forward, we're going to skip over going into the details of colonization because we're focusing just in Europe at this point. And we're going to skip over into the modern forest common movements. So in the past 100 years, in places like Norway and Sweden, they're going back to creating forest commons in an effort to decentralize what was previously crown land and to keep the timber industry in check. These forest commons are often a way to give extra income to farmers while keeping tracts of land out of the hands of the timber industry by preventing the timber industry from buying up land just to extract all of its resources for gain. The modern forest commons place restrictions on how land can be held and used. And the modern forest commons also help to preserve the right to roam among the common people, allowing locals to use the land held by other individuals or by the municipality for subsistence. Within this, we also need to talk about specific land usage rights within the modern commons. So some groups have different specific land usage rights than others for the forest commons, and the main example that's of importance are the Sami people, who use the land specifically for reindeer husbandry, and they have those specific rights. This means that the Sami can use the same lands that are held in common by other group, such as farmers, within the limitations of the specific land usage rights that they have access to. So using that land specifically for the purpose of reindeer herding. The modern forest commons face completely new challenges in sustainability, equity, and the connection to industrialization. Since most of the people live in cities now, the forest commons cannot sustain the larger herd sizes that would be needed to feed the growing populations. So most modern forest commons also have restrictions on harvesting timber because the need would just be too great, and for that reason it would devastate the ecodiversity. The other challenge that is faced is the tourism industry, which threatens the biodiversity and ecosystems of modern forest commons because they didn't realize that they would need the regulation for that originally, because that was not something that was part of the historical forest commons. So most recently, climate concerns and sustainability and biodiversity have begun to shape the legislation involving modern forest commons. This means revisiting how land held in common can be used by industries, including the tourism industry. And it also means movements to rewild land, such as reintroducing species that have long been extinct, such as the buffalo or the aurochs. And an attempt to create a new and complete ecosystem to improve biodiversity. The other thing that is starting to be discussed, not just in the forest commons of Northern Europe, but a larger discussion that's starting to go on, is the re-spiritualization of nature. So this is the stage where we're at now. We're beginning to realize that our rupture from nature is harming ourselves and our environments. And we're realizing that we need the connection to nature for our own well-being, and that this outweighs the value of commodification of natural resources. We see this in the demand for ecotourism because there is that desire to return to nature. Also, the idea of the return to earth-based spirituality. The interest in things like forest bathing and nature pilgrimages, they're skyrocketing. On the surface, this seems very superficial, but it's driven by the desire to feel connected to the land again. So this is the post-colonial and post-industrial world that is starting to emerge. We're seeing discussions on a global and national scale about the rights of the natural world. We're met with the idea that trees or rivers have personhood, and that means that we need to discuss what rights these other than humans then have. In many ways, the existence of modern heathenry is a natural step in the progression back to the connectedness with the land. We've been severed from the land and from our ancestors, and we are starting to reclaim that. We are actively working to decolonize ourselves. And I'm sure that some of you might not like my word choices. They might seem too extreme for you. But I hope that you'll continue with me into the next section, see how, when I start to shift the focus to Canada, how this starts to make sense for Canadians as a whole, for Canadian modern heathens, in rebuilding relations with the land where we live, being sensitive to our shared history with Indigenous people around the world. As before, the references for this section will be below, as well as the link to my blog if you prefer to look at the written copy. And I will see you very shortly for part 3.